What's going on, people? Welcome to Food Chest. Hope you're having a great week so far. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching from. Top of the day to you. And thanks again for all the subscribers. If you haven't done so already, kindly subscribe to the channel. Much appreciated. Gives me the motivation to keep creating educational content that you can learn from. That's all it is. So I appreciate you for watching. Make sure you watch the content. It also helps the channel. And, likes, comments, all of that. Much appreciated, all right? And again, I hope you're having a great day. So I'm not the kind of person that jumps into bandwagons. And I'm not the kind of person to just hear something and then just like create something about it just to feed off the buzz. I really like to do my research. And I really like to make sure that the information I'm bringing out is educational, is informative, and it has a weight to it, and it's credible. It's important, right? So, within the last 3 to 4 years, right? There's this whole trend of putting African countries against one another, whether it's Ghana, Nigeria, which is one of the most popular ones. But one of the ones that I've been very much interested is the South African and Nigeria beef, right? It's like, why? Like, it's West and South. It's like a whole different words, culture is a bit different. Even though I believe that most African countries culture is almost the same. It's just that people have a different way of doing the same thing. And again, I'm not the type of person to have countries live on old glory and things like that. But I think sometimes it's, according to the famous rapper that we all may know, when ish hits the fence, sometimes you got to pop out and show out. You know what I'm saying? So it's important for us to kind of know the relationship between these countries and what brings about like the beef. Like, so when it comes to Nigeria and South Africa, we've seen it over the last 4 years, whether it's the famous Nigerian men stealing South African women. And South African women love them some Nigerian men. Whether it's Afrobeats versus Amapiano. Then to more serious things like the xenophobia that is prevalent in Southern Africa against Nigerian people who live over there. And then the accusation or the stereotype of a lot of South Africans who believe that Nigerians who are in their country are kind of, doing the most when it comes to drug dealing and, various corrupt practices. Is this really the case? Or is it not the case? What else is there between the South African-Nigerian relationship past social media? Is there really beef when it comes to the real thing, which is economic relationship, trade relationship, social relationship? What are some of the intricacies between those countries? That was my curiosity, and that is what I'm going to share with you today about. Stick around, we're going to get into it, and you're going to learn some things that you never knew today, so just stick around with me, all right? See you on the other side. Let's go, huh? Food chest. All right, so like I mentioned before, just kind of going through some of the relationship between South Africa and Nigeria. I think it's one of the most interesting relationships when it comes to things even past social media, right? And it's important for us to kind of know some of these relationships. And I'm going to start with the historical concept and historical relationship. Then we're going to go into kind of the trade relationship. And we're also going to go into like some diplomatic relationship and the reason for some of the adversarial kind of relationship between South Africa and Nigeria. So let's start historically, and this is going to be interesting for you to know. Now, the history of South Africa and Nigeria began in the 1960s. Of course, we all know that within the 1960s is kind of when Nigeria got its independence from 160 years of colonial rule. So within 1960, Nigeria receives its independence. We have to understand that during this time, Nigeria is kind of struggling with stability in terms of its governance structure, governance style. Is it going to be a democratic society? There were military regimes which were prevalent even within those times. And, looking at how colonial era left countries in Africa, there was separation within the countries, and there was tribalism. There are different things going on. And coincidentally, this is the same time as well, South Africa, it's kind of the height of the apartheid. You can say apartheid, however you want to say it. I think it's all correct, right? This is when apartheid was became prevalent in South Africa. So, most importantly, one of the things that hit Nigeria most was, in 1960, it's indicated that 69 black people were massacred in Sharpeville, South Africa, by white apartheid police, which is the same time Nigeria got its independence. Hearing this, Nigeria, boom, formed a relationship with South Africa. Now, during this time, of course, the Prime Minister of Nigeria was Tafawa Balewa. When he heard about this, he immediately sent a letter to the African National Congress, also sent to the militants in the 1961, kind of formed a relationship and sent a letter to South Africa indicating that Nigeria is willing to help. Now, more specifically, as time proceeded, in 1976, Nigeria set up the Southern Africa Relief Fund, which was to bring relief to the victims of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And they provided kind of educational opportunities to South Africans in general, things like welfare, help. The military administration of General Obasanjo during that time contributed about $3.7 million to the fund. Again, also, my resource is going to be in the comment section. Again, if you have questions about where I'm getting this information from, I'm going to kind of cite some of them. So like I was saying, the president, the administration of Obasanjo was really pivotal. And they contributed about $3.7 million. And again, this is within the 1970s and 60s. So these amounts are really, it's a lot of money. Now it might seem a bit less. Even now it's a lot of money, but then that was a huge amount. So they contributed this to the South African Relief Fund. Also, what General Obasanjo did during that time was that he also made personal donations of about $3,000 and also asked members of the cabinet to contribute about $1,500 each to the fund. Apart from this, all Nigerians who were part of the civil servant also made a contribution of 2% donation from their monthly salary to the South African Relief Fund. Students during that time, they skipped their lunch to make donations, and in 6 months, in 1977, the contributions by Nigerians were up to $10.5 million, which was used for the South African Relief Fund. And most importantly, most of you must have heard of something called the Mandela tax. So this 2% donation that was mandatory for Nigerian civil servants. I can remember that those days, when I was born, my parents talked about this, because in the 90s, which was when the apartheid movement was ending, you heard about Nigerians kind of talking about, we had to, there was Mandela tax. So you kind of caught a glimpse of some of these things as we were born, and as our parents started to tell us things about some of the things that they had to go through, independence and post-independence in Nigeria. So the Mandela tax was this 2% that a lot of Nigerian civil servants had to contribute to the Southern Africa Relief Fund. Now, what was this money used for? So basically, the funds were used for, it was indicated that about 87 South African students came to Nigeria in 1976 following the disruption of the South African educational system. After the massacre of 700 students by the white police regime during that time, while they were protesting against the decision of the apartheid regime to change their educational language to Afrikaans. This was interesting to me because, I've talked about some of some of this in my other posts about some Southern African countries, and there are some comments I've received indicating that Afrikaans is not, it's like an indigenous Southern African language. Now, my question to my Southern African subscribers and listeners who I love is that, is Afrikaans an indigenous language to Southern Africa? Because I know it's spoken in most Southern African countries, or is it a language that was created by the colonizers to make themselves feel part of Africa? Because my understanding is that for example, in Cape Town, I've heard some of my friends have told me that some jobs you have to speak Afrikaans, which some South Africans don't even know how to speak. So I'm curious to know, because some people argue that it's an indigenous language to South Africa, which I don't think is true, but I stand to be corrected. So moving on. So hundreds of South African students benefited from the funds. Some of the activities is that it provided free education to South Africans when they came to Nigeria. And also, beyond welcoming the students who were exiled, Nigeria had also welcomed many of the politicians and dignitaries of Southern African, like Thabo Mbeki, who stayed in Nigeria from 1999 to 2008 before he also went to Zambia, to Lusaka, where he also stayed. So also during that time, most South Africans couldn't travel. So what did Nigeria do? Nigeria also provided passports to about 300 students, including government officials, were given passports, and Nigeria lobbied for the creation of the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid and chaired it for 30 years, longer than any other country. Between 1973 and 1978, Nigeria contributed about $39,000 to the UN Educational and Training Program for Southern Africa, a voluntary trust fund promoting education of the black South African elite. In terms of trade, Nigeria stopped its oil exports to South Africa for decades in protest against the white minority rule in South Africa. Nigeria had lost approximately $41 billion during that period. Above all, Nigeria was the only nation worldwide that set up the National Committee Against Apartheid, which was the NACAP, as early as the 1960s. Nigeria unequivocally took over leadership of the anti-apartheid movement worldwide, despite the volatile nature of Nigeria's politics and the passage of numerous military civil leaders, which I had mentioned initially. But, irrespective of all this, Nigeria never abandoned its support to free South Africa when it came to the apartheid regime. From 1960 to 1995, Nigeria spent over $61 billion to support the end of apartheid, more than any other country in the world, according to the South African Institute of International Affairs. That's a lot. And just to kind of say a little bit about this, I remember, to kind of back this up from my experience, although I wasn't born in 1960, 1970, I didn't witness all of this, but I remember as a secondary school student in Nigeria, African history is not taught as much as it should be taught contextually. And what I mean by contextually is that, sometimes the history that is taught in most African countries is not, consistent with the country itself. It's not contextual to the country's experience. It's most of the time, it's juxtaposition of various things that are not relevant, and it's not targeted. But I think that when it came to South Africa and Nigeria, the only history that I, for some reason, was excited when it was taught was the apartheid thing that happened in South Africa. I think that we watched Sarafina. The first time I watched Sarafina was in Nigeria in my history class. Literally, Sarafina was a movie that was showed in most Nigerian schools educationally. No other, even like movies when it came to the Biafra War was not showed in Nigeria. But the Sarafina was shown. And we discussed Sarafina in my history classes in Nigeria as a secondary school student, which was great. But it kind of speaks volumes to the kind of relationship that Nigeria really wanted to have with South Africa historically. But it's unfortunate that that's not really what it is today. So I'm going to move on. Now, that's a historical context. And we can see that some of this history, you can say it was one-sided. And this is one of the problems. Now, I don't mind Nigeria being helpful during this time to a country like South Africa. But I think that there's an ungrateful, niche that is happening today, that South Africa sees Nigeria as less than in a lot of ways. And I'm going to discuss this further, which is why, and during the colonial era, the West did this to Africa. It's important for countries, when you're doing good in the now, you also have to think about the future. And how, because things change. Politics change, governments change. You have to think about how you can also benefit when things change. Because the standard you are in today, which is the case of Nigeria, within the 1960s and Nigeria, the Nigeria that we have today is not the same. So I think that Nigeria could have done more in protecting itself when it was giving aid to South Africa, looking at the future, which is a problem that Nigeria still has up to today. I think most of the deals Nigeria make is in the now. The government does not think about the impact of the future. But we're going to also talk about that. But moving on. Now, let me talk about the trade relations between South Africa and Nigeria. Now, it's important to indicate that within the 90s, so with the end of Apartheid, in 1994, 1995, trade relations between both countries were prevalent. So Nigeria and South Africa enjoyed a time of good trade. So basically, according to sources, right, the 1990s marked the end of apartheid, like I just mentioned, followed by the introduction of democratic rule in 1994 in South Africa. 5 years later, Nigeria witnessed the return of democracy as well, after nearly 2 decades of military dictatorship within the country. Since then, trade between Nigeria and South Africa has grown over tenfold. In 1999, there was just, 4 major South African companies doing business in Nigeria. In less than 2 decades, the number of South African companies rose to more than 100, spanning across the telecoms and banking sector in Nigeria. Nigeria became South Africa's largest trading partner in 2006. The bilateral trade between both countries, that is, hovered in terms of amount, 1.5 billion to about 16.5 billion in 1999. So it increased between 1999 and 2006. The trade between both countries increased in terms of revenue, which was great. But that's not the status quo today. So this is still 90s, early 2000s. Now, I was curious to kind of see how Nigerians thrive doing business in South Africa. So Nigeria accounts for about 60% of South Africa's trade in West Africa, and as of 2020, which is recent, trade between both countries stood at $2.9 billion. In 2021, the balance of trade was heavily tilted. Nigerian exports were valued about 2.2 billion, and South African exports stood at 569 million. But we have to understand that the majority of export to South Africa from Nigeria was from oil. However, when it comes to companies, Nigerian companies in South Africa, it's indicated that there are less than 10 registered Nigerian companies in South Africa. So currently there are 6 companies investing in South Africa. From 2008 to 2020, we have the Dangote Group and GZI accounted for the lion's share of the investments. Nigeria's Access Bank acquired South Africa's Grow Bank for $60 million in 2021. The Nigerian fintech company, Paystack, and airline Airpeace also have imprints in the Southern African business environment. However, several Nigerian businesses have experienced little success in South Africa. And a lot of them exited the market. Examples of them is This Day Group, Arik Air, and Bearview Airlines. So, although we have businesses, Nigerian business in South Africa, there's not much success within the South African market. We're going to look at the reason for this, but it's good to know these numbers and to see how post-historic times, how, Nigerian companies are traveling in South Africa and how South African companies are traveling in Nigeria. Now I'm going to move on to South Africa doing business in Nigeria. Now there are over 100, like I mentioned before, there are over 100 South African companies doing business in Nigeria. Most popularly, as we all may know, is the MTN Group. We have ShopRite, we have MultiChoice, we have Standard Bank, we have Remgro, we have Pick and Pay Holdings, Clover Industries, and Naspers. Now, these are all South African companies who are doing business in Nigeria. We can see that South Africa has more stay within the Nigerian economy. And the reason for this, I would say, is because I think that South Africa has developed over time a more strong and mature corporate culture than Nigeria. I think that, one of the reasons why, one of the things that lack within the Nigerian corporate system is, I believe, is standard. I think that Nigeria, I think that has changed now, but, and it takes time for trust to be developed. And even though that Nigerian has increased its standard of doing business, it's still going to take time for other countries and other investors to trust that standard and to know that this standard is going to have a long-term view. I think that Nigeria has done business within, it works, we're just going to do it anyhow. As long as it's working, it's great. There's no standard of excellence or the pursuit of excellence. And this also has to do with customer service. I think that Nigeria lacks a culture of customer service. I think I've traveled around Southern Africa, and I think that customer service is way better in Southern Africa. I think the west of Africa is still struggling with the idea of good customer service and the idea that the customer is always right. It's not prevalent in the west. Things are changing, but it hasn't become the status quo. And I think that is why a lot of Southern African countries thrive better within the West. And to stay within context, South African companies specifically thrive better in and out of South Africa than West Nigerian companies thriving in Nigeria. And that is not to say that that's the only reason. I think there are more reasons why. I believe that because of the way South Africans look at Nigeria, I think it has an effect also in terms of how South Africa accepts Nigeria. I think we have to also be realistic in the sense that social context matters as well, and with the stereotype, and I also think intimidation has a thing to do with it as well. A lot of African countries are intimidated by Nigerians, and I think that has a thing, and this is not to say, this is not to big up chest. I think it's a psychological thing. And I think it's a thing that has to do with how Nigerians present themselves. Nigerians can be overpowering and overbearing sometimes. While most of this, being in Southern Africa and having traveled and lived there for, a couple months, they are more relaxed. It's like the difference between, it's like living in Barcelona. Catalonians are very relaxed people. And I think that's kind of how Southern Africans are, especially when you talk about people from Zambia, Namibia. It's a very relaxed culture. And I think that it's much different with Western, more specifically Nigerian culture. And I think this has an effect as well when companies come within those countries and trying to thrive within those countries. But when it comes to, like, most experts kind of say that some of the disparity is that when it comes to historical developmental trajectory, South Africa has had a much relatively strong and mature corporate culture than most countries like Nigeria. So that's one of the reasons why we see that South African countries thrive more. Now, when it comes to diplomatic relations, there has been a lot of rift between both countries. And if we can remember back in 2017, the High Commissioner of Nigeria in South Africa was recalled. And there was a kind of tension between both countries. The same thing within that year, most Nigerian students shut down the NTN headquarters in Abuja. Due to the killings of Nigerians in South Africa. We cannot deny the xenophobia that's happening in South Africa when it comes to the killings of Nigerians. I think in over 3 years, millions of Nigerians have been killed in South Africa. And of course, they talk about the fact that, there is drug selling. But again, there is truth to it. But again, there's a market for it. I think that most of the times, countries have to look inward and not look at there's a demand for the product. And that's a story for another day, though. So, on my take on this relationship, and I think I wanted to kind of do this so that people can understand the reason why a lot of Nigerians kind of don't understand why South Africa is so hostile towards Nigerians. But again, one thing I want to indicate is that I think it's more of the younger generation. For me, I've traveled to South Africa. I've been to Cape Town. And in all these African countries I've ever traveled to, my reception, and again, I travel with my Nigerian passport, my reception in Cape Town was very welcoming. The young man who was, not a young man, he was, I wouldn't say he's in 40s and 50s, maybe that's why, who received me, the immigration officer, when I came to Cape Town. One of the things he said is that, I don't even understand why you guys need passport to come to South Africa. I never understood why he said that, but doing my research, I kind of understand, because they believe that with the help that Nigeria has given South Africa over the years, that the relationship should be deeper. Nigerians shouldn't have to need visas to travel to South Africa. And a lot of experts believe this as well. Some people indicate that even with the help that Nigeria gave to South Africa during the Apartheid time, as early as 2013 when Nelson Mandela died, the Nigerian president was not even allowed to say anything. Nigeria was not recognized. Rather, South Africa recognized the presidents, the European presidents who were in support of the apartheid regime, like France. Countries like the US were given opportunities to speak, were reverenced more than the African presidents, more specifically a Nigerian president, who from what I've indicated, had foot on ground, did things to alleviate the apartheid regime. Which I think is also part of the psychology of Africa. Africa seems that they seem to have this messiah mentality of the West, of our colonial masters, and reverencing them more than their counterparts on the continent, which is something that I'm going to talk about on my other post when it comes to why young presidents in Africa are more successful. Stay tuned for that discussion I'm going to have. So I think it's unfortunate that South Africa has not recognized or does not recognize the place Nigeria has played within the development of the country. Also, when it comes to the economic relationship, it's uncertain that South African economy will ever recognize Nigeria. I don't even know if there's a push for Nigerians companies to invest in South Africa, because statistics show that the economy of South Africa has been stagnant for decades now. So I don't know if there's a push for Nigerian companies to actually go into South Africa. Also, when it comes to South African companies in Nigeria, I think that there are various red tapes when it comes to administration and taxes that hamper the success of South African businesses in Nigeria. Not only South African businesses, but a lot of businesses as a whole. So there are frictions between both countries, but I think that seeing that South Africa and Nigeria are both giant economies on the continent, there is need for them to work together. And there is need for there to be more cooperation that I see. Now, does the social internet beef play a role? I think it does. I think that it plays a huge role even with economic relationship, because perception matters a lot. And I think that some of the perceptions that are heavily preached on social media has an impact to play, and has had an impact to play, and it makes both countries forget about their historical context. But I don't know I can't really say the way forward, other than there needs to be more economic relationship, more symbiotic relationship between both countries. Now, I don't know what you guys think. I don't know what, I'm open to some of your contributions on the ways forward between both countries. Are we going to stick with the beef that is going on, or do we think that South Africa and Nigeria really has much to play in terms of making sure that the continent of Africa is a heavyweight continent going forward in the future? And do we think that economic relationships need to really be more symbiotic, even when it comes to the visa restriction thing and having much trade? And Nigeria needs to diversify, man. Too much of oil trade. There has to be other things that Nigeria has to offer. And I think that both countries need to work on really relaxing some of the red tapes within the countries, to make sure trade is happening and to enable much partnership between both countries. But yeah, guys, let me know what you think. I think it's interesting to look at the historical context of the relation between both countries. Let me know what you think about some of the points that I've made. Again, some of my sources are in the comment section. Contribute. I would really love to hear your comments on how you think the relationship stands and how things can become better going forward. Once again, it's your boy. This is Food Chest. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe and stay tuned for more informative content.